Imagine this, a quiet forest in Europe, 8 decades of silence, and then a team of forensic experts uncovers something no one expected, a single human fingerprint frozen in time since 1944. It belonged to a German soldier who vanished during one of the war's bloodiest campaigns. For 80 years, no one knew his name. No one knew his fate until now. This is the story of how a forgotten soldier finally came home. Not through medals or monuments, but through science, persistence, and the power of memory. You know, when we think about World War II, we often think about the big moments: D-Day, Stalingrad, the liberation of concentration camps. We think about generals and presidents, about turning points that changed the course of history. But behind every one of those monumental events were millions of individual stories. Millions of young men and women whose names we'll never know, whose sacrifices became part of a vast and terrible tapestry. And among those millions were thousands who simply disappeared. To understand what happened to one man, we must first understand the world he vanished into. Picture Europe in 1944. The war had been raging for 5 years. 5 long years of destruction, displacement, and death. By that point, the outcome was beginning to tip. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June. The Soviets were pushing westward from the east, reclaiming territory the Germans had seized years earlier. Italy had already switched sides. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, was beginning to crumble. But make no mistake, it was still extraordinarily dangerous. In fact, some historians argue that 1944 was one of the most chaotic and deadly years of the entire war. Why? Because as the front lines shifted, as armies advanced and retreated, the organized structure of warfare began to break down. Communication lines were cut, supply chains collapsed, units were separated from their command. Entire battalions found themselves trapped behind enemy lines or scattered across unfamiliar terrain. Imagine being a soldier in that environment. You might start the day with your unit intact, following orders, moving toward an objective. By nightfall, after an artillery barrage or an ambush, you could be alone in a forest with no idea where your comrades are, no radio, no map, and enemy forces closing in from every direction. Thousands of soldiers went missing in exactly this way. Not killed in dramatic battles that made it into the history books. Not captured and logged into prisoner of war records. They just vanished, swallowed up by the chaos. Some fell in small forgotten skirmishes. Others died of wounds or exposure while trying to find their way back to friendly lines. Still, others were buried hastily by civilians or by enemies who didn't record their names. The specific region where our soldier disappeared was one of these places. A rural area caught between advancing and retreating armies. Forests, farmland, small villages that changed hands multiple times. One day, you'd see German patrols. The next day, Soviet or American troops. Local residents hid in cellars, trying to survive the storm passing over them. In this confusion, military record-keeping became almost impossible. Company rosters were lost. Dog tags were separated from bodies. Graves were unmarked or destroyed by subsequent fighting. And so, tens of thousands of families were left with nothing but a telegram. Missing in action. Not dead, not alive, just gone. And then, like so many before him, he disappeared into the fog of war. His name, though it took 80 years to say it with certainty again, was Johann. Let's call him that because behind every statistic there was a name. Behind every missing soldier there was a young man who once had a life, a family, hopes for the future. Johann grew up in a small town in southern Germany. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where church bells marked the rhythm of the week and harvest festivals brought the whole community together. He wasn't a career soldier. He didn't dream of military glory. He was a farmer's son, a young man who worked with his hands, who knew the smell of fresh-cut hay and the weight of a plow. But when the war came, it didn't ask what he wanted. Conscription swept up young men across Germany, pulling them from fields and workshops and universities. By 1943, Johann found himself in a Wehrmacht uniform, assigned to an infantry division tasked with defending territory in Eastern Europe. His letters home, the few that survived, paint a picture of a man trying to make sense of a senseless situation. He wrote to his mother about the cold, about missing her cooking, about hoping the war would end soon so he could return to the farm. He didn't write about ideology or politics. He wrote about small things, the things that mattered. In early 1944, Johann's unit was involved in a defensive operation. The Red Army was pushing westward, and German forces were struggling to hold the line. It was a brutal, grinding campaign. Not a single decisive battle, but weeks of constant combat, retreat, and repositioning. Artillery fire, sniper attacks, nighttime raids, the kind of warfare that wears men down to shadows of themselves. According to fragmentary military records, Johann's company was ordered to reinforce a position near a river crossing. It was a strategic point. Lose it, and the entire defensive line would collapse. They marched through dense forest, under the cover of darkness, trying to reach the position before Soviet forces could take it. They never made it. Somewhere along the way, the company was ambushed. Or maybe they stumbled into a larger enemy force. The records are unclear, chaotic notations scribbled in haste. What's certain is that when the survivors regrouped the next morning, Johann was not among them. Neither were a dozen others. A sergeant noted it in his report. Missing, presumed killed in action. That was the last official word. Johann's mother received a letter months later, informing her that her son was missing. No body, no confirmation, just a terrible, hollow uncertainty. And with that uncertainty, a mystery began, one that would last 80 years. Family and comrades left without answers. Imagine what that's like for a moment. Your son, your brother, your friend goes off to war and simply doesn't come back. There's no grave to visit, no closure, no final goodbye. You're left suspended between grief and hope, unable to fully mourn, because some small part of you wonders, what if he's still alive somewhere? What if he's in a prison camp, or suffering from amnesia, or hiding in some remote village? Johann's mother waited. Every knock on the door made her heart leap. Every letter from the government brought a mixture of dread and hope. But as the months became years and the years became decades, hope gave way to resignation. She never stopped wondering, though. Never stopped imagining where he might be. This wasn't unusual. Across Germany, and across every nation that fought in World War II, families lived with this agonizing uncertainty. The International Red Cross estimated that by the end of the war, over 1 million soldiers from all sides were listed as missing. 1 million families left in limbo. How were missing soldiers documented at the time? Well, the system varied depending on which army you served in and when you went missing. In the early years of the war, record-keeping was relatively organized. Soldiers carried identification tags. Units maintained detailed rosters. When someone was killed, efforts were made to record their name and location. But by 1944, as we've discussed, that system was breaking down. Bureaucracy couldn't keep up with the scale of casualties and the chaos of collapsing front lines. Documents were lost in fires, floods, or the general disorder of retreat. Entire archives were destroyed in bombing raids. In Johann's case, the records that survived were minimal. His name appeared on his unit's roster. There was the sergeant's brief note about him going missing. And that was it. No details, no follow-up investigation. The war was still raging, and there were a million other crises demanding attention. After the war ended, Allied forces and later the German government made efforts to account for the missing. Teams traveled across Europe, searching battlefields and burial sites, trying to match bodies with names. They established war cemeteries where unknown soldiers could be laid to rest with dignity, even if their names were lost. But these efforts could only do so much. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Bodies buried in remote forests or shallow graves on abandoned farmland weren't found. Records that might have helped were scattered across a divided Germany and a fractured Europe. And so, year after year, Johann remained one of the missing. His name on a list. A fading memory in his hometown. A photograph on a mantle that fewer and fewer people could put a story to. Why did this case remain unsolved for so long? Part of it was simply the passage of time. Witnesses died, landscapes changed. A forest that saw battle in 1944 might be a housing development by 1984. Graves were lost under roads, fields, construction projects. But another part was resources. As the decades passed, the urgency faded. The world moved on. New crises demanded attention. The generation that lived through the war began to pass away, taking their memories with them. By the 2000s, most of the missing from World War II were assumed to be lost forever. Their stories would remain incomplete. Their families would never have closure. But history, no matter how buried, has a way of resurfacing. In 2019, a team of researchers and volunteers, part of a nonprofit organization dedicated to finding and identifying missing soldiers, received a tip from a local historian in Eastern Europe. The historian had been interviewing elderly residents about their memories of the war. One woman, now in her 90s, remembered something from her childhood. She remembered soldiers fighting in the forest near her family's farm. She remembered the sound of gunfire echoing through the trees, and her mother pulling her into the cellar to hide. And she remembered, weeks later, after the fighting had moved on, the smell that came from the woods. The smell of death. Her father had gone into the forest and found bodies. He'd done what he could, covered them with soil and branches, said a prayer. But he was a simple farmer, not a soldier. He didn't know these men's names. He didn't report it to any authorities because in those chaotic days there were no authorities to report to. The woman had carried this memory for 75 years. Now, near the end of her life, she wanted someone to know. She wanted those men to be found. The research team took her seriously. They interviewed her at length, asking about landmarks, distances, directions. Memories from childhood can be unreliable, especially memories of trauma, but she was remarkably clear. She led them to the general area, now a dense, overgrown forest managed by the state. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and began to scan. It took weeks. The forest was large, and they were looking for disturbances in the soil that could be decades old. And then, one afternoon in late summer, the equipment detected something. An anomaly in the ground, the kind of signature that suggests something organic was buried there long ago. They began to dig. The site was hauntingly quiet. Tall trees filtered the sunlight into soft green shadows. Birds sang. A light breeze rustled the leaves. It was peaceful now, but the earth beneath their shovels held evidence of a very different time. As they carefully removed layers of soil, they found it. Human remains. Not one skeleton, but several, buried close together. These were soldiers who had fallen where they fought, hastily covered by someone who cared enough to give them that small dignity. The team worked slowly, meticulously. Every bone, every scrap of fabric, every object was documented and preserved. Among the remains, they found fragments of uniforms, buttons, belt buckles bearing German insignia, a rusted canteen. These were German soldiers, no question about that. But who were they? That's where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. But the most extraordinary revelation was yet to come. You see, finding remains is one thing. Identifying them is quite another. Usually, forensic teams rely on a few key pieces of evidence. Dog tags are the gold standard, a metal tag with a name and identification number stamped into it. But in this case, there were no dog tags. Either they'd been lost in the fighting, or they'd corroded completely after 8 decades in acidic soil. The next option would be dental records. Every soldier's military file included information about their teeth, fillings, missing teeth, distinctive features that could help identify remains. But dental identification requires access to complete records, and as we discussed, many of those files were destroyed during and after the war. DNA analysis is another modern tool, but it's complicated. You need something to compare the DNA to a living relative. And after 80 years, finding a direct descendant of a soldier who disappeared in his early 20s isn't always possible. Many never married or had children before they went to war. The team began the painstaking work of cataloging everything they'd found, preparing the remains for transport to a forensic laboratory. They weren't optimistic about making identifications. More likely, they thought, these soldiers would be laid to rest in a war cemetery with honors but without names. But then, one of the forensic anthropologists noticed something unusual. On one of the skeletal hands, in the soil still clinging to the bones, there was a fragment of skin. Not much, less than a square inch. It had been preserved by a remarkable combination of circumstances. The soil's pH level, the depth of burial, the absence of oxygen, and perhaps the cold winter that followed the burial. All of these factors had essentially mummified this tiny piece of tissue. And on that fragment of skin, faint but visible under magnification, were ridge patterns. Fingerprints. Now, if you're thinking this sounds impossible, you're not alone. The team's initial reaction was skepticism. How could fingerprints survive 80 years in the ground? Skin decomposes. It's organic material, after all. Given enough time, it returns to the earth. But here's what you need to understand. Decomposition isn't a uniform process. It depends on environment. Bodies buried in peat bogs have been preserved for thousands of years. Mummies in dry desert climates last for millennia. And in rare cases, when conditions are just right, soft tissue can be preserved long enough to yield evidence that seems almost miraculous. The forensic team carefully extracted the tissue sample and transported it to a specialized laboratory. There, using high-resolution photography and digital enhancement, they were able to capture the fingerprint pattern in extraordinary detail. One print, one match, and a lost soldier was no longer a ghost. But here's where the story gets even more remarkable. Having a fingerprint is only useful if you have something to compare it to, and this is where meticulous German record-keeping from the 1930s and 40s came into play. When Johann and millions of other young men were conscripted into military service, they underwent a thorough processing. Medical examinations, aptitude tests, and yes, fingerprinting. The Wehrmacht, like most modern militaries, kept fingerprint records for identification purposes. Many of these records were destroyed during the war or in the chaotic years that followed. But not all of them. Some archives survived. After German reunification in 1990, efforts were made to consolidate military records from both East and West Germany. These archives were eventually digitized and made available to organizations working to identify missing soldiers. The forensic team submitted their fingerprint to the database. And after 80 years of silence, the computer found a match. Johann Weber, born 1923, conscripted 1943. Assigned to the 12th Infantry Division. Reported missing in action, March 1944. After 8 decades, a name had been restored to a set of remains, but more than that, a story could finally be told. Once the identification was confirmed, researchers went to work, piecing together everything they could about Johann's life. They contacted local archives in his hometown, requesting birth records, school records, anything that might help paint a fuller picture of who he was. They found more than they expected. Johann had been the second of 4 children. His father had died when Johann was young, so he'd grown up helping his mother run the family farm. School records showed he'd been a decent student, not remarkable, but steady and hard-working. A teacher's note from 1938 described him as quiet, reliable, good with his hands. He'd been engaged to be married. Her name was Anna. They'd grown up together, started courting when they were 17. There were letters between them in the town archive, not many, but enough to glimpse their relationship. She called him her steady Johann. He called her his sunshine. They'd planned to marry in the summer of 1943, but Johann received his conscription notice in the spring. The wedding was postponed. "When I come home," he wrote to her, "we'll have the biggest celebration this town has ever seen." He never came home. Anna waited for years. She never married. She worked as a seamstress, lived with her sister, and according to people who knew her, she never really got over losing Johann. She passed away in 1987, still wondering what had happened to the boy she'd loved. Reading about her life, knowing she'd spent decades in that terrible uncertainty, makes this story so much more than a forensic curiosity. This wasn't just a skeleton in a forest. This was someone's son, someone's fiancée, someone who was loved and missed and mourned. Humanizing him is more than just a statistic. That's what makes this story matter. Johann wasn't a Nazi villain from a movie. He wasn't an ideological zealot. He was a farm boy who got caught up in a catastrophic war, who probably had no strong feelings about the politics that sent him to die in a foreign forest. He was a victim of history, like so many others, but identifying a name was just the beginning. The next step was perhaps the most emotionally complex, finding living relatives. Johann's mother had passed away in the 1960s, never knowing what happened to her son. His siblings had scattered. One brother emigrated to Canada. Another died young. His sister moved to northern Germany and married. The research team worked with genealogists to trace family trees forward through the decades. It took months. Many leads went nowhere. But eventually they found her. Johann's great-niece, living in Hamburg. She was in her 50s, had never known her great-uncle except as a name mentioned occasionally by her grandmother. When the team contacted her, she couldn't quite process it at first. Someone who'd been gone for 80 years was suddenly found, identified. It seemed impossible. They met with her, showed her the evidence, explained how the identification had been made. They gave her copies of the letters they'd found, the photographs from the archive. They told her everything they'd learned about the uncle she'd never known. She wept, not just for Johann, she said, but for her grandmother, Johann's sister, who had died 10 years earlier, still wondering what had happened to her brother. She would have wanted to know, she said. She talked about him sometimes, wondered if he'd suffered, wondered if anyone had buried him properly. This is what families of missing soldiers live with. Not just grief, which is painful but finite, but uncertainty that stretches across generations, the questions that can't be answered, the what-ifs that multiply over time. For 80 years, Johann's family had lived with those questions, and now, finally, there were answers. After 80 years, a chapter was finally closing. The German War Graves Commission took custody of Johann's remains, treating them with the reverence due to any fallen soldier. There's a complex protocol for these situations. Even though the war has been over for nearly 80 years, even though the regime he fought for was evil, individual soldiers are still afforded respect and dignity in death. Because here's the thing. Condemning the Nazi regime and honoring individual soldiers who were caught up in it aren't contradictory positions. Most of the young men who wore German uniforms were conscripts, not volunteers. They didn't choose the war. Many didn't support the ideology. They were just trying to survive, trying to do their duty as they understood it, trying to get home to their families. Johann's remains were prepared for burial. His great-niece was consulted about the arrangements. She chose to have him buried in a military cemetery where other soldiers from his division had been laid to rest after the war. There would be a headstone now, with his name and dates, a place his family could visit. The burial ceremony was small but dignified. Military representatives attended, along with members of the organization that had found him. A chaplain said prayers. His great-niece placed flowers on the coffin, white roses, because Anna had loved white roses. Local media covered the story. It resonated with people in a way that surprised some observers. Why care about a German soldier from World War II in 2023? Why does this matter? But if you understand the human element, if you see past the uniform to the person, then you understand why it matters. This was a family finally getting closure. This was a young man finally being honored and remembered by name. This was history acknowledging the individual lives that were lost, not just the grand sweeping narratives. And with that, the past stood face to face with the present. Let's talk about the science behind what made this possible, because it really is remarkable. Fingerprint analysis has been used for identification for over a century. The basic principle is simple. The ridge patterns on your fingertips are unique to you. No two people have the same fingerprints, not even identical twins. These patterns form before you're born and remain unchanged throughout your life. When fingerprints are collected, whether for employment, military service, or law enforcement, they're stored in databases. In the old days, that meant filing cabinets full of cards. Today, it means digital databases that can be searched in seconds. The challenge in Johann's case wasn't the comparison process. Modern software can compare a fingerprint to millions of records almost instantaneously. The challenge was preservation. How does organic tissue survive 80 years of burial? The answer lies in chemistry and luck. Decomposition requires certain conditions: oxygen, bacteria, moisture, warmth. Deprive a body of any of these, and decay slows dramatically. In Johann's case, the soil where he was buried happened to have high clay content and low oxygen levels. The depth protected the remains from temperature fluctuations, and the first winter after burial was unusually cold, which may have frozen the tissue before decay could progress. All of these factors combine to create a tiny window of preservation. It's extraordinarily rare. Of the millions of soldiers who died in World War II, only a handful of cases have yielded identifiable fingerprints decades later. This is what makes Johann's story so exceptional. It's not just that he was found. Remains are discovered fairly regularly. It's not just that he was identified. DNA and dental records make that possible in many cases. It's that he was identified through a method that shouldn't have worked after so much time. It's a reminder that even when we think history has closed the door on certain questions, sometimes, just sometimes, science and circumstance conspire to give us one more answer. But beyond science, this is about something far greater. The broader significance of cases like this extends far beyond one soldier or one family. Around the world, there are still hundreds of thousands of missing soldiers from World War II. They're in forests like the one where Johann was found. They're in jungles in the Pacific. They're in the depths of the ocean, entombed in sunken ships. They're in fields that are now parking lots, in hills that are now suburbs. Every nation that fought in the war has organizations dedicated to finding and identifying these missing. In the United States, there's the Defense WWII Accounting Agency. In Russia, there are volunteer groups called search battalions that comb former battlefields every summer. In Germany, the War Graves Commission continues its work. In Britain, Australia, Japan, everywhere, there are people who believe this work matters. Why? Because unresolved stories of World War II continue to echo today. Families still live with uncertainty. Communities still have gaps in their memory. History itself is incomplete when we lose track of individual lives. Every year, dozens or sometimes hundreds of missing soldiers are identified and returned to their families. Each one is a miracle of persistence and technology. Each one represents closure for someone who'd lived their whole life wondering. And here's what's really moving. This work is being done for soldiers from all sides. Allied, Axis, everyone. Because at the level of individual human beings, we recognize that these were all someone's children, all someone's loved ones, all people who deserve to have their names remembered and their sacrifices acknowledged. Each discovery isn't just about the past, it reshapes the present. When Johann was identified, his family's story changed. The narrative that had been suspended for 80 years could finally move forward. His great-niece could visit his grave. She could tell her own children about their great-great-uncle, not as a mystery, but as a real person with a real story. And that story becomes part of how we understand the war. Not as an abstract historical event, but as something that happened to real people. People who had families, who fell in love, who made plans for futures they'd never see. There's power in that. Power in remembrance. Power in refusing to let people be forgotten just because time has passed. Johann's story is one among thousands still missing. But it's also a symbol of all of them. Every time a soldier is identified and brought home, it's a victory against forgetting. It's a statement that these lives mattered, that these sacrifices are still honored, that we haven't moved on so completely that we've left the dead behind. One fingerprint, one match, one life restored to history and memory. For 80 years, his story was lost beneath the soil, but the truth waited patiently to be found. Stories like this remind us that history isn't just written in books, it's etched into the ground, carried in families, and preserved in every trace we leave behind. Think about that for a moment. Every life leaves traces, fingerprints, literally and figuratively, marks we make on the world and on each other. Johann's physical fingerprint survived long enough to give him back his name, but his other traces, the letters he wrote, the memories people carried, the love Anna held for him until her own death, those survived too. We're all leaving traces. The question is whether anyone will remember them, whether anyone will care enough to piece together our stories when we're gone. Organizations and volunteers who do this work, who search forests and databases, who refuse to let the missing stay lost, they're honoring something fundamental about human dignity. They're saying that everyone deserves to be remembered by name. Everyone deserves to be brought home. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor the countless lives that still remain nameless. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because every story remembered is a piece of history restored. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping ensure that stories like Johann's aren't forgotten,